I was tempted, Jeff, to have the kids stay for a moment longer. Thanks for unpacking that. There's another significant word in that passage that goes along exactly with what Jeff was talking about. And it is the word, well, let me ask the group, see if you notice this. Who is the one leper who responds to this healing that took place in the story?
Mm-hmm.
Who is the one leper who responds?
Samaritan.
Did you get it in the
Samaritan.
the Samaritan?
She always could have been too.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
We want to talk about stereotype and stigma and being ostracized. The Samaritan is it. Luke doesn't unpack that. Luke is kind of sold out to Empire a little bit. But as Jesus often does, he turns stuff upside down and jabs us with it, and we have to think about it. So as I'm doing this last in the series of 3 sermons this morning, put this passage from Luke in the background, because it serves us well. It fits in a very general way, a metaphorical way, many of the things that I'll be talking about. The passage from Jeremiah is also a curious one. I debated whether I could do anything with that Jeremiah passage, and then I thought, wait a minute. Jeremiah is all about providing hope in the midst of exile. This is what Jeremiah is about. Exile is a phenomenon that many people know all too well. The other night, Sea Raven and I went to see the movie The Birth of a Nation, the new one that just came out. And it is the story of Nat Turner's rebellion that lasted all of 48 hours. It's a very, it's a well-done movie. I recommend that you see it. It's very gory, but it is about the abuse of slavery. And of course, people, black people, and they're not the only ones, by the way, but we're talking about largely the institution of slavery. Black people were brought to this nation, in effect becoming exiles from their own land. And they have had to do precisely what Jeremiah is talking about in this message of hope that he's providing, because he hopes, Jeremiah hopes, that the people will return. Well, sometimes that doesn't happen the way people might hope that it would happen, and so they have to make their way in other places as best they can, and we're still struggling with all of that. So put these 2 passages, they're powerful, I think, as backdrop to this sermon this morning. One more thing I'd like to have you do, and that is open your hymnals again to the first hymn that we sang, number 607. And I want you to look down at the bottom where you will see the name Per Dietz. And you will also see that this hymn was written in 1935 in Berea, Kentucky, for a conference, for a youth conference. You all see it? And in addition to that, you will also see that this hymn is famous around the world. All right, keep that as backdrop. This hymn is a very special one for me. I have known it virtually all of my life, and I mean all of my life, from the time that I was a child to this point in my life, and I'm almost 79. That hymn was written by Perd 3 years before I was born. And it just so happens that my parents, not yet married, were at that conference in Berea, Kentucky. So that's part of the significance of the hymn. That conference had as its theme, Youth Building a Better World. Another attendee at that conference was a 15-year-old black prodigy youth who spoke named James Farmer, who later became a great leader in the civil rights movement and a leader for the Congress for Racial Equality, known by the acronym of CORE, C-O-R-E, Congress of Racial Equality. And it just so happens that at the end of that conference on a Sunday afternoon, James Farmer, who was going to yet another conference in Detroit, asked my parents, now this is Kentucky they're in, Berea, Kentucky, for a ride back to Michigan, because my parents lived north of Detroit and would be returning in that direction. And my parents naively suggested that, yes, well, certainly they would take James Farmer, they would be glad to, but they suggested that they would all stop somewhere along the way, probably in southern Ohio, at a rest home and stay for the night, overnight. They had what were called rest homes. Do any of you remember those? So the people's homes, and they rented out rooms for the night. And you could see a sign, didn't have motels then. And James Farmer looked at my parents and said, "You gotta be kidding. We're not gonna stop at any rest home." He knew the score. All of a sudden, the relevance of that conference was seen by my parents, not yet married, in bold and stark relief as the reality of systemic racism reared its ugly head on the highways and the byways of this country. Combating racism had been one of the topics discussed at that conference, and certainly constituted a pivotal moment in the continuing development of my parents' idealism, an idealism which I obviously have as well. And many years later, I actually met Perd Dietz, and he and his wife Thisbe became close friends of Carol's and mine when we lived in Montclair. Perd was then retired. Actually, I had met Perd's son and his wife much earlier while I was still at Oberlin. But nevertheless, I cherish my friendship with Perd Dietz, who wrote that hymn. I tell this story for several reasons. First, to illustrate, remember this was 1935, almost, well, coming up on 80 years, all right? 80, what?
81.
Anyway, first to illustrate that the journey of fighting racism, dismantling racism, is a long, long one. A seemingly unending road in our country. And second, as my father has pointed out too many times to me, much to my chagrin most often, we have made considerable progress over the years in combating racism. At several junctures in my life, I've really doubted that. The third reason for telling the story is to remind us again that we are linked with the rest of the world in this interconnected web of creation, and that fighting racism here is also fighting racism around the world. First, I want to press that point in a minute, but first let me invite you to consider that the United States of America has two significant legacies. We have a bunch of them, many of them not very admirable, and I don't really want to talk about some of them. We see them rearing their ugly head in this political campaign now. But one of the legacies, of course, is racism. It is an insidious evil. And the other legacy, I think, which is monumentally great, is anti-racism. And these two legacies are linked at the hip, as it were, one dependent upon the other. You can't have anti-racism without the racism to begin with. The negative one, is rightly referred to as America's original sin. Slavery, and it's racism. It is historically the root of our national shame. And it is not so much that racism and its cousins, religious bigotry and ethnocentrism and xenophobia, have not and do not exist in other places, but that America has raised racism to an art form, culminating in, as you know the list, Civil War, Jim Crow, segregation, and all of the subtle and not so subtle forms of racism that are still with us today. The other legacy, the positive one, is anti-racism. And its history is rich and tragic, filled with heroes and heroines, with scenes from the mountaintops of victory and the searing pain of the assassin's bullet. It is a history and legacy of great song and great literature, of marches and protests, of the arc of justice and love, of the deepest yearning of the human spirit and the human body to be free. It is a history of sacrifice, vicariously given to a cause far beyond the cause to defend a nation, precisely because it is a cause to defend all of humanity, regardless of any earthly circumstance. Its history is an inspiration not only in this country, from the civil rights movement, and today with the Black Lives Movement, but the almost endless list of movements that have sprung up in our nation over its 400 years of existence. But it is also an inspiration to the world at large. Rarely, I think, if ever, have most of us thought of the legacy of anti-racism as a gift, let alone a gift to the world. In the midst of our struggle to garner dignity and freedom for all, how often have we gotten beyond the front lines to realize that people like Sojourner Truth and John Brown and Harriet Tubman and Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the countless millions of ordinary people who have engaged in the struggle for freedom were not only gifts to us, but to the whole world. It is important and even crucial to see that not only is racism an evil, but that anti-racism is a continuing gift to all of us and to the world as we together struggle for freedom. James Lowen, one of those historians who writes history from the bottom up, from the people who actually lived it and had the experiences, rather from the perspective that historians generally use of those who won the victories in battle and exercised the power. Lowen nails the point precisely, and this is what he says. Anti-racism is one of America's gifts to the world. Its relevance extends far beyond race relations. Anti-racism led to a new birth of freedom after the Civil War. Twice, once in each century, the movement for black rights triggered the movement for women's rights. Throughout the world, from South Africa to Northern Ireland, movements of oppressed people continue to use tactics and words borrowed from our abolitionist and civil rights movements. The clandestine early meetings of anti-communists in East Germany were marked by singing, "We shall overcome." Iranians used nonviolent methods borrowed from Thoreau and Martin Luther King to overthrow the hated Shah. Ho Chi Minh's desk, when he died in Hanoi, had on it the biography of John Brown. Among heroes whose ideas inspired students in Tiananmen Square and whose words spilled from their lips was Abraham Lincoln. In a lighter vein, somebody has gone to the trouble to gather statistics on the seemingly mundane fact of the number of streets named after Martin Luther King. There are 650 or more in the United States alone. But there are also hundreds of streets and parks and monuments named after him in Australia, France, Germany, India, Israel, Italy, Senegal, Zambia, to only mention a few. So what appears at first to be a cold and unimportant statistics is writ large around the world. Jelani Cobb, writing in the New Yorker, points out the irony that American foreign policy for the last 7 years has been in the hands of a black president as the world looks at the contradictions of history of slavery and racism on the one hand, and the power of anti-racism, which brought him into that office in the first place. It is not the office of the presidency which inspires in this case. It is the fact that a black person is in that office. Stop for a moment and think of the great contribution that Negro spirituals have made to the freedom movements around the world, or the great impact that musicals Rodgers and Hammerstein have had upon oppressed people around the world. Elsa is going to play at the end of the service, not yet, Elsa, you don't need to go yet. Elsa is going to play at the end of this service, "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught." Do you all know that song from South Pacific? You know, the backdrop of that story. I won't go through it now. But this is a powerful anti-racism song, known literally around the world. Oklahoma, which has undertones of the same thing. The King and I. All of these are much more than entertainment. They pack a solid message that is heard perhaps more profoundly in other places around the world than it is right here in our own country. Some of you know that I am a graduate of Oberlin Seminary. I was in one of the last classes before it merged with Vanderbilt. So I also have a master's degree from Vanderbilt, and I've never been there. Anyway, Oberlin is a fantastic community, and its history is phenomenal. It is known as the town that started the Civil War, and it is the first college in America that admitted women. 1833. Home of the Underground Railroad for slaves escaping to Canada. Lake Erie is about 10 miles above Oberlin. It in itself is an inspiration for the world for racial justice. There's a story that not too many people know, but people in Oberlin do. In 1888, a young man from South Africa, whose name was John Dube, D-U-B-E, traveled to Oberlin from South Africa because he was inspired by Oberlin's legacy. After his studies, he returned to South Africa and he established the first Zulu language newspaper and founded an institute, a school, named Olange Institute, the first secondary school set up by and for indigenous Africans. Its motto, not surprisingly, is learning and labor. And if you know anything about Oberlin College, its motto is learning and labor. Okay? Dube borrowed it. Thank goodness. John Dube went on to help found and then became the first president of the African National Congress, known around the world as ANC. A full half-century after its founding, the leader in the ANC in South Africa was Nelson Mandela. Ended apartheid, and the ANC became the dominant political party through free and democratic elections. It was a long half-century to get to that place, however. For decades, ANC leaders, most notably Mandela, were held in prison on Robben Island. And in that prison, Mandela and the other prisoners, inspired by Dube, educated themselves and many of the white prisoners as well. John Dube died in 1946. But when Nelson Mandela voted in the first race-free election, race-free election in South Africa's history, he left the polling place booth opposite Olange Institute. And he paused and he said, and this is where the grave of John Dube is, and Mandela said, "Mr. President, I have come to report to you that South Africa is today free." It's been a long journey, hasn't it? And here we are in 2016. Many of us are deeply concerned and troubled by the racism that continues in our society. We are sometimes angry, sometimes hurt, sometimes bitter, sometimes overwhelmed. It is hard sometimes to know what to do. And this happens to be one of those times when I might well argue with my father and suggest that we haven't made much progress in the 80 years of my life. And yet, in my more reflective moments as I step back, I know that we have made progress. I realize the irony and the paradox in our journey, for just when it seems so terrible, 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 looked at in a different way, through the prism that King called the arc of the universe, which he said is long and it bends toward justice, echoing a great Unitarian minister, Theodore Parker. That's where King got that phrase from. I realize that there is a very different picture. We are, first of all, talking about race and racism more than we ever have in a generation. And that's good. That's good. And it is talk not behind the scenes anymore, but it is on prominent display Hillary Clinton even talks about systemic racism. Most people don't even know what that is. That's progress. In Frederick, Maryland, where I live, we are discussing and debating the very place of Roger Taney's statue on the courthouse lawn. You know, Roger Taney was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott decision. If you don't know that decision, go home and look it up. It's a pivotal case. It's a very sad case. This is significant because we want, and we are talking about this, we want to preserve history and tell the truth about the real story, but in our growing maturity, we no longer find it appropriate to honor and glorify racism. So here's a question for you. It's hard work. Jeff laid out some work for the kids. This is our work. How do we remember and tell the story of our past and at the same time lift up for all of the world to see the fruits of anti-racism? The Confederate flag has come down in many places because of what it represents. But many would suggest that, and I'm one of them, that it cannot simply be put in the closet and forgotten for all of the evil and suffering that it represents, any more than we should ever forget the Holocaust. There is a movement to do away with and change the state song of the state of Maryland, a song that glorifies the Confederacy, disparaging in sick and almost pathological pornographic language the Union, calling for vengeance and referring to the North as scum. Governor Hogan doesn't want to change it, but you just wait. I'm working on it. Our friend Justice Scalia, who just died, that great defender of 19th century jurisprudence, in all due deference to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's friendship with him, that didn't really mellow the man much. He, along with Justice Roberts and Alito, are responsible for dismantling anti-racism, namely the Voting Rights Act. And it's interesting to examine Scalia's comments over a period of about 3 years on this issue. He spoke about this in a statement in 2013 when the Senate had just renewed that Voting Rights Act. This is before it was struck down by the Supreme Court. And Scalia said in his statement, and this enactment, he was talking about the Senate, not a single vote in the Senate against it. How times have changed. Now, he went on, now I don't think that's attributable to the fact that it is much clearer now that we need this. I think it is attributable to a phenomenon that is called the perpetuation of racial entitlement. Think about that for a minute. The perpetuation of racial entitlement. And then he said, it's been written about. Well, I don't know where it's been written about. Whenever a society adopts racial entitlements, it is very difficult to get rid of them through any normal political process. I don't think there is anything to be gained by any senator to vote against continuation of this act. I'm fairly confident that it will be reenacted into perpetuity unless a court can say that it does not comport with the Constitution. Well, of course, that's what he did 3 years later. Yes, Justice Scalia, it is difficult to get rid of racial entitlements. White racial entitlements were written into our very Constitution right from the beginning. And the problem is that Scalia was talking about black racial entitlements. And what his action effectively did was to do away with the whole movement in voting rights as one dimension of racial justice. And Justice Scalia, bless your soul, it's called white privilege. It is the paramount paradigm of our age. To be sure, I suspect, and I will give them the benefit of the doubt, that Scalia and Roberts and Alito and Thomas, ironic, isn't it, are not personal racists. I suspect they do not see themselves that way. But they are the purveyors, with decisions like this, of systemic racism. Scalia went on in a later article and in a later decision regarding affirmative action in Texas, and he talked about a slower track for black college students. Now, if you don't recognize that, that's a dog whistle. We don't even need to go there. So, there are two big legacies at the top of the list in the United States of America: racism and anti-racism. And both legacies stand in front of us in the world continuously. We might wish that the former go away, but it's not going to. All the more reason that we become ever strengthened and empowered by anti-racist movements. We have our work cut out for us in this country. I do, living in Frederick, Maryland. You folks live in Virginia. I don't even know what to say. You need to address the systems of racism and bigotry. We all do, no matter where we are located. And it may be, and I suspect it is the case, that we will never reach that promised land that King talked about, but for the sake of the world, we need to keep climbing that mountain so that we can look over and be inspired and do more. We are still called, as my colleague and friend Perd Dietz said way back in 1935, to build temples that will bridge the human rift, to dream the dream that hardens into deeds of justice, to love so deeply that we heal the brokenness of our collective lives, that there might be freedom for all. Amen.
Amen.